TLC. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and I even put on a necklace because I'm feeling fancy, I guess. And today I am doing a video wrapping up 3 books that I read back in August of last year, 2019. I'm not particularly in a mood to comment on how far behind on my monthly wrap-ups I am. I have wrapped up some batches of books that I've read since then for certain readathons or that fit a certain theme or something. So I'm not this far behind in like wrapping up books full stop. I am, however, this far behind in monthly wrap-ups. And no further comment on that. It is what it is. Now, I did read a 4th book in the month of August that I'm not actually wrapping up in this video because it belongs in a different video that I also have not filmed. But the 3 books I'm going to be talking about here are all books in series. One is the first book in a series, the second is the 3rd book in a trilogy, and the 3rd is the 2nd book in a trilogy. They're all fantasy, and I do not own print copies of any of them. The first is Rosemary and Rue by Seanan and McGuire, which is the first book in the October Day series. This is urban fae fantasy, and the plot of this book is primarily a murder mystery. The ebook copy of this that I read was, I believe, a NetGalley download from the Hugo Voter Packet last year because this series was nominated for Best Series. And what can I say? I was entertained by this, but a little underwhelmed. This is about a woman named October Day, Toby for short, who is a changeling, and in this world that doesn't mean what I normally think of a changeling as being as someone who is swapped at birth and is either a fairy in the human realm or a human in the fairy realm. In this series, a changeling is someone of mixed human and fae blood. So she's in a sort of awkward position between the human and fae worlds where she can't live a normal human life, but she's sort of a second-class citizen with weak magic in the fae realm. At the beginning of this book, we get some backstory for her. We learn that she was living in the human world and working as a PI, while on a case she was entangled in some magic and she got turned into a fish for a number of years. And the story of this book proper begins sometime after she's been turned back into a person again, and she has sort of lost everything in this interval of time when she's been gone. She's lost her human family because there's no way she can explain to them what happened to her, and she's withdrawn from the fairy world, and she's trying to live a normal human life very under the radar, and that doesn't go well for her. The murder in this case is a murder of a fae woman living in, I think this takes place in San Francisco, am I right? Anyways, this fae woman who's been a part of Toby's life, who has been living this very upper class life in the mortal world, has been murdered, which is something that doesn't happen much with the fae because normally they're, you know, immortal unless killed. And in her final act before her death, she has magically compelled Toby to solve the murder. So she gets pulled back into the circles of all these old acquaintances with all of this old, you know, resentment and feeling, bundled up into all of it in order to solve this mystery. And Toby is sort of one of these urban fantasy characters that's very much a type that I'm not that particularly fond of reading. She's like very bitter and hardened with a lot of pain in her past and all of that. It's not my favorite character type, but it's a thing in urban fantasy. She has several different potential love interests who are introduced over the course of this book. It wasn't really into any of those potential relationships either. I think the most interesting thing about this book, and the thing that I latched onto as being what I recognized as very Seanan McGuire about it, comparing it to the other books of hers that I'd read, which are the Wayward Children novellas, which are much more recent, is this very cool world building that she does. You can tell that there's a lot of world mythology and folklore going into this fae world that's left to be explored in future books. However, I don't feel like the writing is as strong as the more recent work of hers that I've read. I felt like the writing in this was kind of flat and generic. I can't say that I'm particularly interested in continuing this series. I gave it 3 stars. However, I totally acknowledge the fact that this is a very long-running series, and it's quite possible that the more recently published books have more of that very engaging writing style that I know Seanan McGuire is now capable of. So I am mildly open to persuasion if any fans of this series want to tell me that they think I will really love this if I keep reading a few books further in. And I do know that the Wayward Children books are a series that I've come to appreciate more in aggregate than I am particularly attached to any of the particular books in that series. So Seanan McGuire's other series may be like that for me as well, I don't know. But I'm not tempted to continue with this series. She's got another one of her long-running urban fantasy series nominated for the Hugos this year. I think that's the Encrypted series, and I'm not particularly interested in reading that either, although I do plan on reading Middle Game, which is her novel that is nominated in the Best Novel category this year. I think I'm probably going to get along better with her more recent writing than going deep into her backlist. But if this type of urban fantasy, gritty mystery thing is your thing, this is a perfectly fine example of it. It's not wildly problematic or like super cringy in any way. Give it a go. Next is a book that I had a NetGalley arc of that I was very highly anticipating and then realized after reading it I was going to be completely incapable of writing like a full in-depth review of. And that is Amnesty by Lara Elena Donnelly, which is the 3rd and final book in the Amberlow dossier. I did a full review of the 2nd book in this series, Armistice, and then this one I just feel like there's no way to talk about it in that level of detail that I like to go into in reviews in a non-spoilery way, because just the basic facts of like which characters are alive and which ones are dead, that's big spoilers. But this is a series set in a non-magical 1930s, 1940s inspired fantasy world. Each of the books in this series take place a number of years apart. The first one involves the rise to power of a Nazi-like political party. The second book takes place some years later, with some of the same characters sort of dealing with the resistance movement from abroad. And then this third book takes place after the Nazi-like government, the Auspies, have been toppled, and there's now a provisional government trying to set up fair and free elections for new leadership. And a lot of the background of this book is about the candidates who are running and what their platforms are. This is a series with a lot of like glitz and glam, sort of sprinkled in, a lot of shady under-the-table dealings going on, a lot of twisty-turny plots. And I will admit, when I saw that this book was going to take place after the toppling of this oppressive regime, I was a little bit shocked because I was not expecting that. I was sort of all prepped for the third book, the finale in the series, to be about, you know, the actual toppling. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this is so brilliant. This book, you know, is set up to deal with some of the repercussions of things that happened in book 1, with the question of who deserves to be brought to justice for allowing the Auspie takeover that happened. And I think this would have been a book that hit home better for me if the way it handled that sort of central issue had been allowed to be more serious and to hold more weight in the story. I do think this book, like the first one, is sort of counting on you liking a certain character more than I happen to personally like that certain character. So I think a little bit of what could have been really hard-hitting political commentary in this book was sort of glossed over by some of the, you know, intrigue shenanigans, but the intrigue shenanigans make this series fun. I do think that it's a pretty consistent series throughout. I gave all 3 books in this trilogy 4 stars. This book asks some interesting questions about like what makes someone a hero or a villain in the eyes of history and how blurry that distinction can sometimes be. And then the third book is A Labyrinth of Scions and Sorcery by Craddock. This is the second book in the Risen Kingdoms series that's going to be a trilogy. The first book was An Alchemy of Masks and Mirrors, which I have a review of on this channel, so I'll link it. This is another book in a series that I think is pretty consistent with the book that came before, but suffered a bit in my judgment of it because I had hoped and sort of expected book 2 to go above and beyond book 1 in a way that it didn't really do. This series follows a princess named Isabel in a 17th century inspired fantasy world with some steampunk elements. The continents in this world are all floating and people travel between them on airships. The country that Isabel is from is reminiscent of 17th century France. At the end of the first book, she had achieved a great victory and found a really exciting place for herself in the world, and all of that is threatened at the beginning of this book when she does something that is very selfless and righteous, but perhaps not particularly well advised. She intervenes to save someone who she knows is falsely accused of a crime, and in the process steps into the middle of a bunch of crazy stuff. I was happy with the first book as a standalone, and I was sort of hoping that the rest of the series would really broaden what we got to see of the world and maybe introduce new protagonists. We don't get that. We get the same 2 main protagonists from the first book, Isabel and Jean-Claude. Jean-Claude is a King's Own musketeer who has been tasked for Isabel's whole life with guarding and protecting her, and he's sort of her stand-in father figure. We do get a lot more of the magic of this world, which is super bizarre. The noble families of all of these different countries have like different really terrifying magical powers. Like, they're not fun magical powers that you would want. They're like really creepy weird. And we only really dealt with 2 of them in the first book. And in this book there's a 3rd type of magic that's featured pretty strongly that is really quite terrifying. The thing that disappointed me in how this book felt repetitive of book 1 is that ultimately it boiled down to like a super nefarious plot that someone has to do something with Isabel because of who and what she is. And I felt that villain plot was really repetitive from book 1, and I wished we'd gotten something different. I wish we'd seen more of the world. This wasn't quite the story I was hoping for. But I still enjoyed it enough to give it 3 stars, and I would consider reading the 3rd book that's coming out, which is going to be called The Last Uncharted Sky. I will consider reading it despite its really terrible cover. The covers for this series have really gone downhill. Like, the first book had a beautiful cover, and then this is just terrible Photoshop. But I do think the second book set up Isabel for the sort of, you know, adventure to other parts of this world that I was sort of hoping that this book would give me, and that it didn't. So there you have it, some muddled, nearly year-old thoughts on 3 books. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you're planning to. Let me know what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.